Hello everyone, welcome to our 8th episode of Realink, where real conversations happen. Realink is a conversation series where we engage our guests to explore various topics that matter in our society and the importance of staying connected with self and with one another. It is also a campaign to raise funds to support the work that we do in Lutheran Community Care Services. You can support us on our giving.sg through the link that will be shown below or QR code that will be flashed on the screen. My name is Nigel, a manager from LCCS, and I will be your host for today's session. Today is the 8th episode of our collaborate series of Realink. In conjunction with the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty this Saturday, we will be talking about the topic on poverty, and we are privileged to have Dr. Paul Ananth Tambyah today with us. Dr. Tambyah is a Singaporean infectious diseases physician and professor at NUS. He is also active in civil society and is currently a board member of the Asia Evangelistic Fellowship, chair of the Nominations Committee of the Lutheran Church in Singapore, chairman of the Singapore Democratic Party, and the president of the Asia Pacific Society of Clinical Microbiology and Infection. He enjoys interacting with young people of all ages and feels very strongly about social justice issues. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Tambyah. Hi, Dr. Tambyah. Welcome to LCCS Realink. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on poverty today.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Great. Hi, I hope you've been well.
Thank you. Yes, I have.
Yes. So, Dr. Tambyah, I understand you've been involved in the medical field for many years, and I'd just like to ask, what brought you to feel so strongly about social justice issues? Or was there a particular incident or event that took place?
Well, both my parents taught us, my sister and I, about social justice issues since we were kids. My father was a dedicated diabetes specialist. He passed away about 9 years ago, and he used to treat many of his old patients for free. My mother is a very well-known social worker, and she taught us both of them actually taught us the importance of looking out for those who are less fortunate than us. And they kept reminding us about how blessed we were to have a happy and stable family with most of our needs provided for. And, when I started working as a doctor, I was really impressed by the highly talented and skillful medical, nursing, and allied health professionals we have working here in Singapore, as well as the really great resources that we have available in terms of drugs, in terms of lab equipment, in terms of tests. But it was frustrating to see that many patients couldn't get access to these because of financial issues. I do ward rounds in general medical wards, in addition to my specialist interests in infectious diseases. And almost every ward round, I would see somebody with a stroke, and then I would go and talk to them, or I'd talk to the family if they couldn't talk. And a lot of the time, we'd find out that they had been diagnosed with high blood pressure maybe a few years ago. And then we asked them, why aren't you on medication for your high blood pressure? And invariably the answer would be, oh, it's too expensive, or I've got no time to see a doctor, I'm working on shift work, and it's very difficult for me to do that. And that was, so, they delay until it reaches the stage where the complication of high blood pressure sits in, and then they end up getting a stroke. And that's far more difficult to treat than just the high blood pressure itself. High blood pressure, you need some medication, you need some monitoring, and you treat it. But if you get a stroke, then it's really hard. Somebody has to look after you, and somebody in the family has to change their job, or sometimes they even have to take a second job so that they can afford to pay a domestic helper to look after you. And so it was really, really frustrating. And, I did my medical school in Singapore. And then after that, I took 6 years of no pay leave. And I did my postgraduate training in the US. And it was kind of sad that what I was seeing in Singapore was actually very similar to what happened in Chicago, where a lot of poor families in Chicago made use of the emergency department in the hospital for their primary care because they didn't have health insurance and they had no access to primary care physicians. I grew up in Singapore in the 1960s and 1970s when we had the $1 polyclinic and the OPD. You could go around the corner and there was some OPD clinic where you just paid $1 and you saw the doctor and you got your medicine. Or if you got admitted to a hospital, it was $5. And over the years, what has happened with the restructuring of healthcare, we are moving closer and closer to the US model, where healthcare is seen as kind of an industry rather than as a form of social need or social service, and that is not just a philosophical thing, because it affects people's daily lives. Like people who get strokes from untreated high blood pressure, and similarly, diabetes is very common in Singapore, and people who don't get their diabetes well controlled, or who don't have access to good medications to control their diabetes, they end up getting amputations of legs, or they go into kidney failure, or they lose their vision, and these things actually just cause things to just spiral down. So that happened a lot in the US, and unfortunately, it's starting to happen here. So these inequalities in an area as fundamental as health disturb me, and so I try to give feedback wherever possible. And at the same time, I read more and more about social determinants of health, and understanding how there was this relationship between health and poverty, and it went both ways. If you are poor in most countries which do not have socialized medical systems, like where there's significant co-payments, like in Singapore or in the US, then you end up automatically not having the same kind of access as somebody for whom a small co-payment doesn't make any difference. But for somebody who is poor, a co-payment will make a difference. And then that leads to worse health. And on the other hand, if you have worse health, if you do not have completely socialized healthcare like you have in some of the Scandinavian countries, then you're going to be poorer. So, for example, if you and so the cycle gets perpetuated. So, for example, if you have diabetes and you don't have access to good monitoring, one of those devices that helps you monitor your sugar, or you have some of the medications which help you to control it in a better way, then you end up losing your leg. And then if you lose your leg, it's very hard to get a decent job. And then if you can't get a decent job, then it gets harder and harder. And then you end up dependent on many of the social safety net programs that exist both in Singapore and in the US. In the US, you end up on Medicaid, and in Singapore, you end up on Medifund. But these need to be renewed every few months, and so it's just a very, very unfortunate situation. And people who do not experience this often have no understanding of this at all. In fact, I have a standing offer open to people who want to find out more about healthcare. We take in JC students who want to get into medical school, and so I've offered to have them, even if they're not a JC student, to try and write in and see whether they can join in this program, to join me on ward rounds or in clinic to understand more about how the healthcare system works, and how poverty actually impacts on the health and well-being of Singaporeans on a day-to-day basis. So understanding this on a day-to-day basis, trying to read more, understand about why it happens and whether there are any alternatives, that was important for me. But I also made contact with organizations in Singapore and beyond, such as HealthServe, in Geylang, Action for AIDS, and the AEF, which help provide healthcare support for disadvantaged and marginalized people. So that's kind of a long story about how I ended up getting involved in social justice issues in Singapore.
Indeed, it really sounds like quite a journey. I think having your parents actually been really the ones that started out having the family to think about the needs of people around you. And finally, I think your experience in the US and how you actually begin to see the needs around you and in Singapore itself, and that began to just brought you to where you are now, in terms of wanting to be interested in social justice issues. And just, it so happens that today we also want to talk about the topic of poverty. And then you have spoken much about it. And we know that the wealth in our nation has grown year on year. The average wealth of a Singaporean is said to have doubled in the last 20 years. And Singapore is said to also be one of the most expensive city alongside Hong Kong and Paris. However, we cannot deny the fact that poverty still exists in the midst of the affluence. You shared quite a bit about how your experience in the healthcare sector and how it leads to inequality and affects the people that are in need. In your opinion, what are some factors that contribute to the issue of poverty?
Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert on poverty, and it's just that I've been in the public healthcare sector for about 30 years now. So I hope you'll indulge me if I mainly focus on healthcare related issues with regards to poverty. And one of the things we talk about poverty, and you mentioned that Singapore is a wealthy city, but an average hides inequality, because if somebody makes $100 and another person makes $1, the average is still 49.5 or $50, and the average doesn't tell you the whole story. But there are certain measures that are used, and there's the Gini coefficient, which is widely used to measure inequality. But in Singapore, the Gini coefficient is a bit unusual in that it doesn't count about 1/5 of the people in Singapore. That's the migrant workforce, because the published Gini coefficient refers to Singaporeans and PRs. So poverty is a topic which is not very well understood. There are a couple of researchers who have done some really good work on poverty in Singapore. Foremost among them is Professor Ng Kok Ho from NUS. And he and his team have put together a really good analysis of what a de facto poverty line is in Singapore. In other words, you need about $1,300 a month for an elderly person in Singapore to live a reasonable life. And if you use that figure, actually, there's a significant number of older people in Singapore who don't quite make it. A lot of them put together from various sources, from their children, from the social service agencies, from voluntary welfare organizations, from the CDCs, and they come close to it. But many of them are way below that around 1,300 sort of de facto poverty line in Singapore. The other person who's done a lot of work on poverty is Professor Teo Yu Yen from NTU. And she's written a magnificent book, This Is What Inequality Looks Like, which was on the bestseller list in Singapore for many, many months. And it's a really good look at people who live in the rental flats, and it's an ethnography, or it's an account of their lives, but it's not told in a patronizing manner. Like, I go there, I see what they do. Oh, so strange, so unusual their behavior is. It's nothing like us. But she actually situates the lives of the people that she studied in the context of her own life. And interestingly enough, something happened to me a couple of weeks ago that really brought that home. My computer died. Now this is a very common occurrence, right? Yeah, every now and again your computer will sort of die. But it died at a really bad time because there was a grant that we were trying to write. There was a research paper I was trying to do, and so I was really in a fix. So what I did was it died on, I think it was Saturday early in the morning. So I went with my wife. We went to Challenger. We bought another computer. And then I took my old laptop to the computer shop to ask the guy to repair it. And he said, oh, it's in bad shape. You need to leave it here. I said, that's okay. I managed to get another one. But there was another kid outside, and she was really desperate because she was trying to get a computer fixed because that was the only computer she had, and she needed her homework done. And her father was there trying to badger the computer shop guy too. And I said to her, don't worry, I'm not going to badger him. He can work on your computer, and then I've got a backup. So that's what kind of inequality actually is that I'm a beneficiary, I'm privileged, I have the ability to get a spare computer, and I have a lot of stuff that is saved in email, and so I can actually get even though my computer died, I was not entirely lost. but I have the resources, and that's because I have that ability, whereas this kid did not. See, that was her only computer, and it had to be fixed. Otherwise, she couldn't get her homework done and couldn't get her assignments done and stuff like that. And then you've got other kids on the other extreme who don't even have a computer. You've got 3 or 4 kids sharing one computer, and they find it really tough with this home-based learning. See, if you're stuck with that kind of situation. So that was challenging, and that was educational. And again, I've learned a lot from reading about Professor Ng and Professor Teo's work, and that's been very helpful. And you know, it wasn't always like this. In fact, again, I'm going back to healthcare again. But when I was a medical student, I did my pediatrics posting at the old history wing of Singapore General Hospital, which later became the Heart Center. And it was built by a donation from a Mr. Mystery who made his fortune with soft drinks. And the wards at that time were classless. There was no A class, B class, or C class because both Mr. Mystery and Professor Ransom and all the other hospital leaders believed that every child deserved the same kind of care, regardless of who their parents were. Unfortunately, that philosophy is no longer with us, and now you've got A class and B class and C class pediatric wards, where the children are looked after by equally dedicated doctors, nurses, and allied health physicians, but they have different levels of space in the ward, they have different nursing ratios, and there's just basically a difference, which never existed in Singapore 20 years ago. In fact, there's a story that's just appeared a couple of weeks ago on social media, and it's about this young man called Xiaoweis, who is a very talented young man. In fact, I got to know him over the last few years, and he lived a very typical sort of Singaporean life, where he grew up in a 5-room flat. He used to cycle through the living room, and then what happened was his sister was diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 4. And she had to go through a number of rounds of costly treatment. She went into remission and she relapsed. And then his father signed on to a questionable business venture, which ended up with him being made a bankrupt. The family had to downgrade, eventually ended up in a rental flat. His sister survived the leukemia against the odds, but dropped out of school, ended up with a teenage pregnancy and a number of other problems. And she and her mother also got into trouble too. So the family frequently had electricity cut off. He had to study by candlelight. And they began depending on his own meager earnings as a young man. And finally, he reached a stage where he had to move out and leave his family to fend for themselves. Things appear to be better, but the family is still not out of danger, and he has a young nephew who's potentially at risk. So I think, you know, Xiaoweis' story illustrates some of the structural issues that affect poverty. So people who don't have credit histories or don't have family wealth to act as a buffer, they resort to loan sharks. You know, you don't get middle class, upper middle class people borrowing money from loan sharks, or you rarely do, or questionable business propositions, which end up getting them into even more trouble. So I think that was again an illustration of how even in a wealthy city there are many people who are living on the edge, and one illness or an accident or a death or a bad decision by somebody, you know, you trust somebody too much, you go into a business venture, you end up going bankrupt, and then you just start spiraling down. So that was, I mean, that's something that needs to be dealt with. And in the past, we had, you know, a welfare state in Singapore in the 1960s and 70s. I know we were not as wealthy as we are today, but there seemed to be a lot less inequality, and the data also supports that. In fact, I mentioned the $1 outpatient clinic and $5 inpatient wards. And despite those low charges in the late 1970s, Singapore had a standard of healthcare which was comparable to the US and the UK. In fact, my father-in-law bought a HDB flat from HDB in the mid-1970s for $35,000. Although his salary went up over the years, it certainly couldn't keep pace with the rising price of HDB flats and private property too. So I think there's a lot of these structural issues which have affected Singaporeans in the last 20, 30 years.
Yes, and you mentioned quite a bit of it in regards to healthcare, especially of how it actually affects poverty, and many of them who are not ready when something strikes them, when something comes, like in the case of Xiaoweis' story, his family, when the sister actually contracted leukemia, they were not ready, and this began to then perpetuate, I think, through the family and many different decisions, and then finally they had to make certain major decisions of downgrading and so on and so forth. And now, besides healthcare, do you think there might be other issues concerning poverty?
Well, the other area which I know a little bit about is education, having been sort of a lecturer and an educator for the last 20 or so years. And again, you see, education is supposed to be a big leveler. And in the 1970s, when all of us had equal opportunities for education, or at least a little bit more equal opportunities than today, there was it seemed to be give everybody a chance. But what's happened in the last 20 years is that education it appears to have become very segregated. And, despite the rhetoric, the top schools, which are the hardest to get into, appear to be concentrated in the Bukit Timah and Bishan areas, where the real estate is the most expensive. And you think about the preschools. The preschools in Singapore are hugely different. You've got the private preschools, which have the latest in educational technology. They cost more than $2,000 a month. They're modern facilities, very small class sizes, highly trained teachers. And then you've got, on the other hand, the simple basic units with very large classes where the children can often get lost in the midst, or some of them end up getting bullied. So children start school at very different levels. And it's very hard for a child to catch up unless they are given a lot of attention or they have a lot of resources. And children start tuition in Singapore really early. And what tuition does is it aggravates the gap between the rich and the poor, because we have a $1 billion tuition industry in Singapore. And what that means is if your parents cannot afford the tuition, you're automatically going to be behind your classmate who can. If that's not true, then the tuition industry is a big fraud. If they are giving tuition to people and it's not going to provide any benefit, then surely that is false advertising. But you hear all these tuition centers which show pictures of people who do so well and score so many A's or get into so many universities. And like I said, unless they are practicing fraud, they are actually aggravating the inequality in Singapore society. And this is particularly acute because we have a big sorting exam, the PSLE. I was looking after an expat in clinic, and she had been diagnosed with TB. And I said to her, you need to go into isolation and you need to be treated for your TB. And she said, I'm teaching in primary 6 and the PSLE is coming up and my own daughter is having her PSLE and I can't go into isolation. My poor students, what will they do? And I said to her, my goodness, you've become really a Singaporean. The PSLE has become the most important thing in your life. Because we know that if you do well in the PSLE, you go into an IP or an SAP school, and the chances you'll get into a university, get a good job, enjoy a comfortable life are very high. On the other hand, if you do badly in the PSLE, you might end up in a school where, like Xiaoweis' sister, you end up with so-called bad company, or even worse, you drop out of school, or you end up with substance abuse. So that's really challenging. The one kicker is that they have this affiliated school thing, and here I want to confess I'm a beneficiary of an affiliated school. I went to St Andrews Primary, and then I went on to St Andrews Secondary, and there was this great moment when you run across the quadrangle. Before that, you're not allowed to touch the quadrangle; it's supposed to be sacred ground. But after the PSLE, when you get into St Andrews Secondary, we all ran across the quadrangle, and so that was a lot of fun. But the reality is that children from affiliated schools get a bonus points when they want to go into the secondary school. So that automatically privileges the child who's in the affiliated primary school, who very often is someone who lives in the neighborhood, which may be a more expensive neighborhood than from a so-called neighborhood school. And this carries on into university. A few years ago, we were doing interviews for the university scholarship. And this is a very generous scholarship because it pays for all your fees all the way through for 5 years of university, and provided you maintain a decent grade point average. And so what we did was we interviewed the top 10 students, and we were going to give out 5 scholarships. And the striking thing was 8 of these students were identical. They were really nice kids. They were from, RJ, Hua Chong, ACSI. They all scored straight A's. They had grade 8 piano or violin. They were active in sports. They were on various sports teams. They had done community service with old folks' homes or with they'd done overseas community projects, and they were really nice. They said all the right things. And then there were 2 students who were very different. One of them was from a poly, and one of them was from a neighborhood junior college. And my fellow interviewer asked all 10 students the same question. And what was striking was the 8 students gave the same answer. The question was, what would you do with the scholarship? So these 8 students, really nice kids, like I said, they said, we'd try and live up to the scholarship, we'd try and give back to society. The other 2 students, they gave a very straightforward answer. The answer was, we won't have to work. Then all of a sudden, it hit home to both of us. See, that's the difference. In Singapore, if you come from middle class or upper middle class family, you go to an elite school, you get the opportunities to do all the CCA, the music, the sports, the whatever it is. And then, you come out as a good citizen, but somehow you may not actually appreciate the fact that your classmates are working, just to put food on the table for the rest of their family. Like Xiaoweis, as a young man, he had to help fill the gaps in terms of his family's income. So that was that's kind of sad, and it's something that we need to do something about.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing about that, how education actually can also cause be a factor that affects inequality in Singapore. And I think you mentioned quite a bit of about education, the system of affiliation, when you actually are affiliated to the secondary school, in your case, at St. Andrews. And I think also, especially when you mention about how the middle income, like many times, they, unlike the ones that are able to afford it, they have to actually work and to actually ensure that they are able to pay off the school fees, or even provide for the family itself. And I think this has been very insightful sharings that you actually have given to all of us here. And I believe you mentioned quite a bit from the beginning of the session about education, about healthcare. These were all factors that, in your opinion, that can actually affect poverty. And I believe gathered here with us in the viewers, we do have a wide range of people coming from various backgrounds. Many of them are practitioners on the ground. Some of them might be in the private organizations, but I believe every one of them here are concerned individuals of this topic about poverty. And I would like to ask, what more do you think we can do regarding poverty in Singapore?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there's a lot that is being done. We have people who raise funds, we have people who give, people who help out, people who volunteer. But I think the structural issues need to be dealt with, and the fundamental issue is the issue of rights versus privileges. Is a safe home environment a right for a child, or is it a privilege? Is good class size, access to the technology you need to study, is it a right or is it a privilege? And this is where advocacy comes in. So, advocacy, my mom, for example, is a classic example of an advocate. She was listed on the Singapore Women's Hall of Fame. They actually have an exhibition on, don't know if it's still on, at the National Museum. And, when I went to the place, I saw a list of social workers and I thought she'd be there. But she wasn't listed among the social workers. She was listed among the advocates. And the reason is that, a lot of people in Singapore, they do charity by raising funds, by volunteering, by helping out. But her specialty is actually acting as the voice for those who are marginalized or who are voiceless. And I'll give you a classic example of that. She started the AWA school, which is a school for children with multiple disabilities, started about 40 years ago. And once the school got off the ground, she got involved in a program called Teach Me, which actually targets children with disabilities who are in mainstream schools in Singapore. And one of the things is a lot of these children were not doing as well as they could because they couldn't get access to therapy. So she remembered that, they had these mobile vans that went around doing x-rays during the SATA campaigns against TB. So she raised funds actually through my dad to get a mobile ambulance which could deliver the therapy to the children. And she was all set to get it running. And then she found out that she needed to pay a COE. And she said, how in the world are we going to raise another $25,000 for the COE for the ambulance? So, if she was just somebody who was a fundraiser, she had said, okay, let's run a fundraising campaign, let's raise the $25,000, and then we'll put the ambulance on the road and help the children. But no, she recognized that this was a structural problem. And so what she did was she has her own style of advocacy, which is very different from mine. I like to joke about it, and I tell her that she stalks ministers. So basically, what she did was she found out that the Minister for Social, at that time was Community Development, was Abdullah Tamugi, and he was going to be at a function at AWARE, and my mom was one of the early members of AWARE, so she called up the AWARE president, and she said, can I meet the minister? And she explained why she wanted to meet the minister, and the AWARE president said, sure, I'll introduce you to him during lunch. So she met the minister, and she told the minister what was going on, that they had this van which had been donated, but it couldn't get off the ground because they had to pay $25,000 in COE. And the minister said, that's crazy. And he said, write to me officially on Monday, and then I'll get the things changed. And so he did. And so that's the difference really between an advocate and somebody who's just volunteering or raising funds. And in fact, there's a book called The Art of Advocacy in Singapore, which is edited by Constance Singham, who just turned 85. And Margaret Thomas, who is the current AWARE president. And what is striking about the book is it's got stories from different advocates, different advocacy groups in Singapore, is that a number of them tell the same story. And I heard this story actually from an HIV advocate in a session at St. Andrew's Cathedral. And this guy told the story about how there were these babies in a river. So in this village, these people saw these babies in the river, and so they started pulling the babies out of the river. And then they started building shelters for the babies, and then they started building boats so that they could pull the babies out of the river. And then they started running nutrition programs to help the babies once they got out of the river, or drying programs to help the babies get dry and run rehab for the babies. And then somebody came into the village and said, hey, wait a minute, why are these babies in the river? He said, do you think somebody is throwing these babies into the river upstream? And they said, no, we should concentrate on helping the babies in the river. Going upstream is politicizing it, or is going too far, And so they just continued doing what they did, where this guy tried his very, very best to stop the babies from being thrown in the river. And essentially that's what an advocate does, is you go upstream. So like my mom, she could have raised funds, they could have got the van on the road, but because she got this, she got the minister to change the policy. So every ambulance now doesn't have to pay COE. So it's not just that one problem that gets solved, but structurally down the road it gets solved for everyone. And I think that's what advocacy really does. But advocacy is also not a lone ranger. It's not just the one guy, because in order for advocacy to work, you have to work together with other people who share the same objectives or the same values. And again, using my mom as an example, after the COE issue, the other issue was the compulsory education. So when Singapore introduced compulsory education, they excluded children with disabilities. And this was a big blow to the parents, because they had wanted compulsory education. Because once you get compulsory education, then the government has to provide it for those who can't afford it. And so, she realized that she needed to get the data. So she worked together with a number of other VWOs. So AWA, which she was involved with, a number of VWOs, and they actually commissioned an academic from NTU to do a survey. And she surveyed 3,000 parents of children with disabilities. And she found out that the vast majority of parents with disabilities, they wanted compulsory education for their children. And they were keen for their children, even those with severe disabilities, to be able to learn, to be able to at least get some degree of mobility or recognition where they could, the belief is that every child should be able to develop to his or her own ability. Not everybody is going to be a superstar or an Einstein, but every child is going to make some kind of contribution. And that's, like I said, something that I've been taught since I was a kid.
Yeah, and I think those two pointers that you brought out is so important. I think you mentioned about the advocacy, whereby it's more than just about the work that's being done on the ground, but it's looking at the gaps and the issues that's originating from going more upstream. And I think more importantly, you mentioned about the need for collaboration. Not just going alone as a lone ranger, but having people, having other organizations to come alongside, having that kind of spirit of community to work together towards that issue. And I think this just reminds me about how the importance of collaboration among organizations even. And I think lately we've been talking a lot even in about this term called collective impact, whereby organizations no longer function in silos, but if everybody could actually put their best foot forward and share a common agenda or issue, I think through that we can solve complex social problems by bending together multiple organizations, I think from different sectors with a common goal. I think with this, I also like to share about one of our programs that we've been doing at LCCS, an initiative called Project Live. Project Live is actually a 3-year program in partnership with Employment and Employability Institute, in short E2I, that seeks to enable low-income families achieve upward mobility. We focus on the upstream work about the strengthening of relationships within the family and the community, that families are able to leverage on one another's strengths so that they can sustain within the community itself. And another aspect of Project Live is to actually enable individuals sustain employment, which is so important because that's where they're actually able to put the food on the table for the family, and also to sustain the school attendance of their children and youth in the family itself, and to last but not least, to cultivate habitual savings pattern through assets creation. And that is a work that LCCS is currently doing, working with low-income families in partnership with E2I. And I'd like to take this opportunity to even ask our viewers that are with us this evening to support our work that we do, and to actually enable us to extend our services to more families. And you can do so by partnering us or donating to us through giving.sg, by scanning on the QR code that's on the screen, and donations above $50 will receive an LCCS Food Trail coupon where you can enjoy discounts from participating eateries. Yeah. And Dr. Tambyah, it's such a pleasure having you with us this evening. And I really enjoyed the session, hearing for the insights from you. And we have a token of appreciation that we have sent to you. I'm not sure if you have received it actually. I think
Thank you very
have,
much.
right?
I'd like to put in my own 5 cents worth on LCCS. To be honest, I was not originally a big supporter of LCCS. In fact, I thought there were already so many agencies out there, and I wondered why we needed yet another one. But over the years, I've been convinced that LCCS really does fit an area of need. They have chosen areas which have been sometimes, in a way, the gaps, areas such as restorative justice in the past, and a lot of the work has been with at-risk families. So I think the work that they've done is really nice. And thank you for this present. It's wrapped up in a really tight wrapper, so I had to start ripping it off early. Oh, very nice.
Yeah, could you tell make out what is it? What is it?
Yeah, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and it says "Stay connected, Realink."
Yeah, so actually this is a jigsaw puzzle that we put together, the 4 different types of conversation that we like people to actually build effective relationships with one another. So if you see the 4 words, it says collaborate, empower, restore, and engage. These are actually the names of the 4 series that we've been showcasing in Realink itself as well. And it really symbolizes the importance of keeping connected with one another and encouraging everybody to have meaningful conversations to add on to one another's life. Yep. So we hope that this will encourage you to continue on the work that you are doing as well, and for our viewers as well, what we have shared today to carry on and to actually push forward the work as well. And so before we end today's session, Dr. Tambyah, do you have any last words that you'd like to leave with our viewers?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to LCCS for inviting me to do this. Belle, it was really nice of you. It came out of the blue and made me think a lot about these issues too, and crystallize some of the thoughts that I've had. Second of all, to everyone who's watching, I seriously think that Singapore can do better in terms of dealing with poverty, and it's not a question of trying to do something new or something different. Maybe it's going back to some of the values that we had in the 60s and 70s when it seemed to be a fairer place to live in. And finally, each of us is put in our own situations, and sometimes we just need to open our eyes and look at the people around us, and then we can be more aware of the situations. I've got a couple of minutes, right? Can I tell another story?
Sure, go ahead.
So I like to help students who are doing research projects because I do a lot of research projects myself. So I recently had a student who was studying at one of the universities in London, UCL or King's College, and he was doing a project on caregiving in Singapore. So he said, "Can I interview you?" I said, "Sure." And then he said, can you tell me about caregivers? People who you encounter as a healthcare provider. I said, well, some people have domestic helpers, but the reality is that there are 250,000 domestic helpers in Singapore and 1 million households. So in other words, 3/4 of the households in Singapore do not have a domestic helper. And he was a really nice kid from a upper middle class family. And he said, I never thought of that. He said, everybody in my demographic has a domestic helper and some of them have two. So I never thought that, for somebody who doesn't have a domestic helper, who's going to look after a disabled older person? Somebody has to quit their job, or they have to put this person in a nursing home, or it's just going to be really challenging. So he in the end, he was interviewing me, but I think he got something out of the interview. So I think all around us, there are people who are doing tremendous work. So we need to just be aware of what they're doing, and maybe start thinking about what are some of the upstream issues that can help address these problems in our country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tambyah, for those words. And of course, your kind words to LCCS as well, and to the viewers as well, sharing your insights. And I believe everyone have really enjoyed themselves at this session to hear from you. And we want to just, I believe if I could have more time, I would extend this session beyond this amount of times for even more sharings that you actually can bring to us. So once again, thank you, Dr. Tambyah, and everyone for being with us, this evening for the episode of Realink. And if you want to watch this episode once again, you can actually catch it on our YouTube channel or the Facebook page. And more importantly, we have a final episode that's coming up this Saturday at 2 p.m. So stay tuned for it, where we will be exploring the topic of emotional healing with Mr. Danny Yeo. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tambyah, and have a good Wednesday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.